Eu gostaria de agradecer novamente, dar um bom dia a todos, sejam todos bem-vindos, agradecer à Interpharma, né, por mais esse evento. Acho que estamos já na 10ª sessão, né, 10, ou 11ª. Tem sido muito produtivo, muito importante, e hoje um dos temas também muito relevantes, né, e que já vinha assim, sendo discutido, enfim, e que agora ainda mais. Então, agradeço a todos pela presença e a Abracro também pelo apoio, e o apoio também de todo o pessoal da Interpharma envolvido na organização, e aos speakers também que se disponibilizaram um pouco do seu tempo aí para compartilhar conosco as suas experiências. Muito obrigado, espero que tenham todos um ótimo evento.
Como a Solange e o Cláudio Osvan já falaram, a gente agradece a participação de todos, agradece em especial aos speakers que vão compartilhar suas experiências com todos aqui. Hoje conosco nós temos a Julie O'Brien, diretora Global Regulatory Policy in Intelligence Regulatory Affairs na Pfizer, Andrew Emmett, chefe de Regulatory Policy para os Estados Unidos, também da Pfizer. Nós temos o Rob Kalesnik Orzlak, peço desculpas se minha pronúncia não é tão correta, que é líder de Regulatory Innovation para evidências de mundo real e ciência de dados de dados na Bristol Myers Squibb, na BMS. Temos a Dina Gifkins, diretora sênior de epidemiologia da Janssen, e nós temos a Julia Luan, diretora Global Regulatory Affairs na AstraZeneca. A todos os participantes, informamos que esse módulo contará com a tradução simultânea, português-inglês, inglês-português, e para selecionar o idioma desejado, clicar no ícone do globinho aqui na parte de baixo. A sessão de perguntas e respostas será realizada nos 20 minutos finais das apresentações. Elas podem ser feitas preferencialmente pelo microfone, já que é uma reunião gravada, né? Fica mais fácil depois para a gente compartilhar com todos, ou pelo chat. Perguntas não respondidas durante o evento serão respondidas via e-mail posteriormente. As perguntas que são colocadas no chat depois, para que aqueles que fizeram por escrito façam também verbalmente. Podemos começar, e acredito que a primeira apresentação é do Andrew. Por favor.
Ray, thank you very much. Let me put my slides up. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Andrew Emmett with Pfizer's Global Regulatory Policy and Intelligence team, and I'm really pleased today to discuss the landscape of real-world evidence policy frameworks along with my colleague, Julie O'Brien. Just a basic disclaimer, this is for educational purposes, our viewpoints, but there's a lot to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about what is real-world evidence and data and how it can be leveraged in decision-making, some of the emerging RWE policy frameworks we're seeing in the United States and in Europe, and Rob with Bristol Myers Squibb is also going to cover a lot of exciting developments in Asia. And then we'll talk a little bit about opportunities for global convergence. And I think a theme that you'll see throughout the day through several presentations is reinforcing some of these basic definitions and principles that I'm going to be covering in my presentation, and then really going into more detail and seeing how that actually applies in real-world examples of real-world evidence. Now, first off, what is RWE and how can it be applied in decision-making? I think from a global perspective, we're seeing an acceleration of the field, which is really being driven by three primary factors. First, new health authority initiatives that are really driving the acceptance of real-world evidence in decision making. Two, the availability, increasing availability of new types of electronic data and increasingly more structured and interoperable formats. And then finally, a rapid modernization of analytical techniques to evaluate these very large and complex data sets. Now, compared to your traditional clinical trial data, real-world evidence can come from a variety of sources, such as electronic health records, claims and billing data, registries, even patient-generated data from smartphones, wearables, apps, etc. And we're seeing that a lot of these sources are really being used in tandem to produce increasingly sophisticated and contextual data. But it's important that we have a theoretical framework about how all of this data will be used in a common terminology around it. I think we're seeing a global emergence of a two-part definition of what is real-world data and what is real-world evidence. Real-world data being the data relating to a patient health status and delivery of healthcare that's routinely collected from a variety of sources, typically in healthcare systems. Real-world evidence, on the other hand, is the evidence regarding the usage of potential benefits of risks and risks of medical products derived from the analysis of that real-world data. Now, that can really lend itself to a number of different study designs using real-world evidence that may be fit for purpose for the particular research question at hand. And this can range from pragmatic clinical trials or hybrid trials that generate real-world evidence within those studies to external or synthetic control arms for a study, particularly in rare diseases, patient registries, and even prospective and retrospective observational designs leveraging real-world evidence. But it's important that if it's going to be used for decision grade evidence, we need to make sure there's the appropriate level of transparency, documentation, and methodological rigor in the study designs. And talking to regulators early on in the process can be very helpful to understand those objectives. Now, RWE can be applied across a large number of use cases, ranging from initial approval, for example, using external control, rapid evidence generation under an expedited pathway for an area of high unmet medical need, but a lot of use also in expanding to new indications, new dosing, new population, and confirmatory studies and post-marketing commitments as well. Now, there's been quite a bit of activity in the United States that I'll cover a little bit. And just one caveat, it's a little bit of a moving target at the moment. Since 2016, the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act really set the stage for the use of real-world evidence in the United States. The legislation established the parameters for FDA's RWE program, including the required publication of a program framework that I'll touch on in a minute, as well as guidance by the end of this year. And FDA is already making considerable progress in this year. I'll also touch on a little bit, looking ahead to the next iteration of some of these pieces of legislation. In 2018, FDA issued their program framework. And in general, they don't endorse one type of RWD over another. It needs to be based on the suitability of the specific regulatory question at hand. But the strengths of the RWE submitted to the regulatory authority is going to depend on the study method, the reliability of the underlying data. And the way that FDA approaches this is they apply a three-part test: whether the RWE is fit for use, that is to say, is the data of sufficient quality? Is it reliable? Is it relevant? Does it actually include the exposures and outcomes that you're studying? Whether the trial or study design are used to generate the RWE can provide adequate scientific evidence to answer the regulatory question you're asking. If not, we need to think about other options. And whether the study conduct meets regulatory requirements, for example, around study monitoring, data collection, audit trail, inspectability, et cetera. Now, there's still a lot that needs to be answered, and FDA and industry are learning from case studies, examples, pilot programs really replicating the reliability of RWE studies compared to traditional randomized clinical trials. But we expect to see a lot of new guidance as early as the end of this year. Under FDA's program framework, FDA committed to not only issuing one guidance, but as many as 4 by the end of the year, looking at general considerations for real-world data and evidence, data standards, what standards are used to submit it to a regulatory agency, whether it be CDISC or OMAP or others, particular considerations around electronic health records and claims data, and then finally, considerations around the use of patient or product registries. Now, while we're still waiting to see these guidances come out, the U.S. Congress and industry and FDA stakeholders are already beginning to look ahead to the next legislative round to see how we can further advance this program even farther than where we are today. And under this PDUFA 7, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, FDA recently released their recommendations for the next iteration that will be passed into law next year. That includes establishing a formal pilot framework for real-world evidence to really create a joint safe space to learn from case studies, to learn from examples of what worked well, what didn't work well, and to get that out into the public domain. 21st Century Cures 2.0 legislation is also building on the original program framework, looking particularly at how real-world evidence can be applied in the context of expedited programs in areas of high unmet need, and also is creating a multi-stakeholder, multi-agency, private-public task force to further advance use cases for real-world evidence and regulatory and other contexts. And taking together, all of this is pointing towards an acceleration of FDA's real-world evidence program in the years to come. But I think we also need to recognize that the pandemic has really pressure tested the field in a way that no one really ever expected. There's really 2 schools of thought here. For example, by necessity, COVID-19 has forced FDA and others to become increasingly comfortable with leveraging RWE to study COVID therapeutics and diagnostics in real time, evaluating the disease epidemiology, assessing product performance characteristics under emergency use authorization, and some FDA leaders even call that the silver lining of the pandemic. An example of this is the Reagan-Udall Foundation's Evidence Accelerator that really brought together the RWE stakeholder community to really articulate what are the best principles for applying real-world evidence to study COVID and potential interventions. We're also seeing a move towards more high-quality randomized clinical trials, including platform trials, master protocols, to answer key questions about COVID. And all of this is in a context where overnight, all of our clinical trials really moved into the digital space. The concept of virtual or decentralized trials, leveraging digital health technologies and real-world evidence to really accelerate trials, to bring them not just to the academic medical center, to the patient's home. These are some durable lessons learned that really improved trials to make them more patient-centric and more efficient, and the type of innovations that we shouldn't lose at the end of the pandemic, and that we should really enshrine in durable guidance. I think coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing a greater integration of clinical trials and real-world evidence in such a way that it provides a much richer toolkit of rapid evidence generation to answer key questions about products, and a lot of lessons learned that can be applied to other areas of high unmet medical need in the years to come. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie O'Brien, who will touch a little bit on the European context. Julie, would you like me to stop sharing my screen, or would you like me to advance it for you?
If you can advance it for me, Andrew, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you. So before I start, I would just like to say thank you to Interpharma and Anvisa for giving me this opportunity today. It is a real privilege to be here presenting this presentation. So I will be providing an overview of European real-world evidence policy frameworks and guidance. Next slide, Andrew. So there is a long history of discussions in Europe on real-world evidence going back to the early 2000s. And this slide illustrates the progress and the various initiatives of the European Medicines Agency on real-world evidence up to the present day. Prior to 2014, discussion really focused on the use of real-world evidence for safety purposes. But since this time, the focus has been moving towards using real-world evidence to demonstrate efficacy. One example was the Adaptive Pathways pilot, which explored the concept of early approvals while based on a robust benefit-risk assessment, but also based on gathering of evidence, real-world evidence in the post-approval setting. In 2017, the EMA and heads of Medicines Agency subsequently set up a joint task force to describe the big data landscape from a regulatory perspective in Europe and to identify the practical steps for the European Medicines Regulatory Network to make best use of big data in support of innovation and public health in the European Union. This task force was made up of EMA and the heads of the national regulatory authorities in the different EU member states. This task force ran until December 2019 and produced a report outlining the key priority recommendations from its work. And these recommendations are entitled the Priority Recommendations of the HMA-EMA Joint Big Data Task Force. So big data is a widely used term without actually a commonly accepted definition. The HMA-EMA Big Data Task Force defined big data as extremely large data sets, which may be complex, multidimensional, unstructured, and heterogeneous, which are accumulating rapidly and which may be analyzed computationally to reveal patterns, trends, and associations. In general, big data sets require advanced or specialized methods to provide an answer within reliable constraints. Next slide, Andrew. Thank you. So building on that, this really provides a snapshot of the recommendations of the HMA-EMA Big Data Task Force. And this is available on the EMA website. The recommendations, in a nutshell, seek to address the infrastructural challenges in the EU with the ambition to improve and expand the use of real-world evidence. An important point to note is that these priority recommendations of the Big Data Task Force are aligned with the broader EMA network strategy to 2025, specifically on the area 2 around data analytics and digital tools and digital transformation. This illustrates the importance of real-world evidence in the broader context of the EU regulatory environment. Upon the conclusion of the HMA-EMA Big Data Task Force in December 2019, a steering group was established. This is entitled the HMA-EMA Big Data Steering Group, and it advises the EMA Management Board and HMA on prioritization and planning of actions to implement the priority recommendations of the task force. The HMA-EMA Big Data Task Force recommendations have now been converted into a work plan, which was adopted in June 2021. A second version of the work plan was published in August of 2021. So if you go to the next slide, and there's a build of 2 pieces, and the second one. Thank you, Andrew. So The HMA EMA Big Data Steering Group began its work in May 2020 and have established this work plan, which sets out actions over 11 areas. The 11 areas are in line with the recommendations from the task force and cover a 2-year period up to 2023. They are also available on the EMA website at the link on the slide. So this work plan is reviewed annually, and it aims to increase the utility of big data in regulation, from data quality through study methods to assessment and decision making. It is patient focused and is guided by advances in science and technology. There's too much to cover here today, but I would like to highlight just a few areas contained in the work plan. First of all, Darwin EU. This stands for Data Analysis and Real-World Interrogation Network, commonly known as Darwin. So currently in the EU, there is limited access to this data, and it is scattered across different partners. It can therefore be very slow to gather and analyse the data. Darwin EU is proposed as a network of data, expertise and services that will ultimately allow EU regulators and potentially other stakeholders such as HTA bodies to access and analyse broad sources of EU real-world healthcare data to support decision-making along the life cycle of medicine development. Darwin EU would function as a federated, distributed data network where a third-party coordination centre would manage requests from EU regulators to analyse a particular data source and would then facilitate that analysis and provide aggregated data back to the regulators. So this process means essentially that the data is queried locally whilst ensuring privacy and protection and allowing for fast access to timely, valid and reliable evidence from real-world healthcare data. Fantastic progress has been made to get Darwin up and running, including the establishment this year of the Darwin EU Advisory Board and the launch of the tender to select the Darwin EU Coordination Centre. Implementation work is expected to start early in 2022, and the ambition is for use cases to be fulfilled throughout the life cycle of medicines. A second area I would like to highlight, which is of great importance, is that of data quality and representativeness. So within this work plan, work is underway to build an EU data quality framework, including the launch of an external study during 2021 to analyse existing data quality initiatives and discuss data quality with a wide range of stakeholders. A workshop is then expected to take place early next year, with the first version of the data quality framework for the EU regulatory network anticipated later in 2022. So the third and final area I want to highlight is that of international collaboration. So this is really vital, and a data standardization strategy for medicines regulation, including big data, will be agreed by the EU regulatory network and published in late 2021 with rollout thereafter. International collaboration on real-world evidence is expected to accelerate, with a summit with international regulators expected next year. So this leads me to my next and final slide. Thank you, Andrew, which addresses opportunities for global convergence through multilateral collaboration. So clearly, there is a huge amount of work and dialogue taking place regarding the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. With so much activity, it is important that regulators and all stakeholders work together to ensure there is a common understanding of real-world data standards and guidance. Ensuring there is a level of convergence will drive greater use of real-world evidence, including in work-sharing initiatives such as the Access Work-Sharing Consortium. If you can get the next slide up, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you very much. The International Council for Harmonisation for Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, or ICH, is likely to act as an important channel in this regard. And momentum has been building over the last few years, in fact, with several real-world data-related proposals put forward, although not accepted at that time. However, in the most recent cycle of ICH new topic proposals, general principles on planning and designing pharmacoepidemiological studies that use real-world data for safety assessments was accepted as a new topic at ICH. Furthermore, ICMRA, the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, has played a vital role, particularly, as Andrew referred to, during the COVID-19 pandemic, in relation to strengthening global collaboration on real-world evidence. In addition, the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, or CIOMS, are also very active in this space, with work progressing at pace to develop a consensus guideline on use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. I would like to acknowledge and congratulate ANVISA on their role in these aforementioned collaborative initiatives. In conclusion, there is significant commitment in the European Union to progress the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. Notwithstanding the complexity of the EU regulatory system, multiple collaborative activities are underway to ensure a framework is in place to leverage data for better regulatory decision-making. Globally, there is a real opportunity now to align on a common understanding of real-world evidence, standards and guidance, and we encourage ANVISA to continue their very important role in these efforts. Thank you for your attention. I'll hand over now to Robert.
Thank you, Julie. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Kolesnik-Orzalak. I work at BMS as the Regulatory Innovation Lead for real-world evidence and data science. And in my portion of today's session, as mentioned, I'll be continuing this conversation around the evolving global picture for real-world evidence and regulatory decision-making by discussing and sharing with you some of the activities occurring in Asia. And more specifically, I'll be walking through some of the different regulatory guidances and activities that have happened recently in Japan, China, Taiwan, and Singapore. So starting with Japan, the PMDA and MHLW have a history of providing guidance and utilizing real-world evidence from a pharmacovigilance perspective and in regulatory decision-making. And they've released several different guidelines on this topic from 2014 onward. And more recently, PMDA has extended the scope of thinking around real-world evidence, not only to safety and pharmacovigilance, but also to efficacy assessment. And we've seen this in particular with a lot of work that the agency has done around real-world data, or one type of real-world data, which is registry data, where specific meeting pathways were released to discuss registry approaches. And the agency released 2 guidelines earlier this year on the topic. The first of these 2 registry guidelines discusses the overall regulatory uses and considerations for registries and regulatory decision-making. And some of the topics included in this guidance include the use of registries for external controls, to also supplement clinical studies and to address post-marketing requirements. So this sort of works as an overall framework for the use of registries in Japan. The second registry guidance is sort of a second step, although released at the same time, which goes into much more detail and does a deep dive on data quality considerations, including details around data controls and quality assurance. Beyond just registries, PMDA has also been interested in the use of real-world evidence using other types of real-world data, and has also released different meeting pathways for databases that are beyond just registries. And earlier this year has actually initiated a real evidence working group to continue this focus around real evidence more broadly, including these other types of data. So certainly, a lot of activity by PMDA in real evidence in this space. And you can see this evolution over time from a sort of safety focus out to other types of uses, including efficacy, with a focus on registries and now also other types of data. So moving on to China and Taiwan, certainly there's also been a lot of activity in these two countries around real evidence in the last couple of years. And similarly, between both China and Taiwan, the two countries have taken similar approaches in that each have issued an overall framework sort of guidance around the use of real evidence that have been followed up with a more specific guidance focusing on data quality. So for example, in China, the NMPA released their broad real evidence guidance in 2020, which described the applicable scope of real evidence in decision-making, as well as general principles to consider. Then in 2021, earlier this year, NMPA also released the second guidance that really goes into much more details around data quality, including data extraction, quality controls, quality management, etc. They also released another guidance specifically on the use of real evidence in pediatrics in 2020, and the situations where real evidence may be used to support pediatric development and registration in China. And then in Taiwan, the TFDA has also released that sort of general real evidence guidelines that's somewhat similar to what was done in China, and this occurred in 2020, which describes the applicable scope of real evidence and decision-making. And after this overall framework, the TFDA also released a more specific data quality guideline in 2021, which includes discussions around data fitness for use, relevancy, and reliability. Also, earlier this year in 2021, TFDA released another guidance that really is more on the administrative side that mirrors what we saw in one of the FDA's guidances that discusses the submission of real evidence that basically helps the TFDA track and be able to analyze the different types of real evidence applications that are submitted to the agency. So overall, a lot of activity in China and Taiwan over the last couple of years around real evidence. And you can sort of see this overall framework followed up by a very specific deep dive on data quality. Then in Singapore, the regulatory agency HSA has also been very interested in real evidence. And there has been some guidelines released in Singapore on the use of real evidence in drug reimbursement. However, although there is this interest from HSA, a guidance around real evidence and regulatory decision-making has yet to be issued. So right now it's sort of more very pragmatically evaluated on a case-by-case basis. That being said, Singapore is also involved in the access collaboration with several other health authorities around the world. And as you can see here, real evidence is included as a strategic objective in their 2021 to 2024 strategic plan. So lastly, just wrapping up with some concluding points. As you can see, real evidence has been adopted around the Asia region as a clear priority from health authorities. And the focus areas have been generally pretty consistent to what we've seen with in the West, including discussions around data quality, study designs, etc. And overall, I think a key theme here, as you can see, all these different countries releasing their own individual real-world evidence guidelines. There's a key need around this harmonization. And Julie very nicely laid out some of the activities that are happening right now around this area from ICH, COMs, and others. But it's not only just international collaboration. To really help move this field forward, we need basically engagement and collaboration across stakeholders, not only just regulators, but academia, industry, and others. So it's really great to have a workshop like today. So I really thank Interpharma and Visa. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And I think with that, we'll stop for Q&A.
Acho que nós vamos deixar as perguntas e respostas para o final de todas as apresentações, Rob. Então,
Okay, thanks. Sounds good.
Hi, everyone. This is Dina Gifkins, and I'll be sharing a little bit with you today on how we can advance the regulatory use of real-world data. Thank you so much for having me to speak here today. I am a full-time employee and shareholder of Janssen, and none of the data I'll be sharing today is confidential or proprietary. So what I'd like to do today is speak a little bit on opportunities for how we can utilize real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, but more importantly, to highlight some of the gaps between potential uses and actual uses, focusing a little bit on some of the methods and challenges that we face using real-world data, and end with a few case examples and our thoughts on future directions. So, in the big picture, the way we think of real-world evidence is one additional piece of evidence that we can use to inform medical decision-making. So we've always relied heavily on preclinical toxicology, pharmacology, clinical trials, the literature, and spontaneous adverse event reporting. And now the world is seeing this rise of real-world evidence being a critical piece of evidence supporting both safety and effectiveness of our products. All of these data combined help to make appropriate decisions about how we can be using our products. I have here just a few different case examples of ways that we can use real-world data, regulatory use cases. The first is for primary approval, and examples of this are historical controls or synthetic comparison groups. The second is for secondary indications, so this would include indication expansions, population expansions, such as towards pediatrics or different stages of disease. The third is adaptive pathways. So this would be more to kind of broaden a patient population for accelerated approval. And the fourth is more traditional that we're more used to in the world of real-world evidence for safety, post-marketing requirements and commitments. So just to delve into that a little bit deeper. So in the case of a new approval, often what we'd want to do is compare disease trajectory to interventional single-arm trial, excuse me, of a new medication when a traditional control trial is not operationally feasible. So this is most often done in the setting of a rare disease or a disease subtype, and when there's no other alternative treatments available. You would need to have a well-defined indication outcome and a predictable clinical course of your disease. And some data sources you can use for this type of assessment would be a disease registry that's pre-existing, electronic health records or administrative claims databases, or even a secondary analysis of a historical randomized controlled trial. The second case that could potentially use real-world evidence for a supplemental indication, you could use some of the same existing data sources, and this would be to expand an indication. The third, as I mentioned, would be confirmatory evidence for accelerated approval. So this would mostly be done in a scenario where an RCT is not feasible or to supplement for additional clinically relevant outcomes. And the fourth is for long-term safety. So here we could be looking to identify a comparator for a single-arm extension trial or in a project registry. There are a few challenges we face when we're attempting to use real-world data for regulatory purposes. One of the most important is how we can reduce potential selection bias. So we need to figure out a way in which we can identify a suitable external control comparison group, and it's not always very straightforward. Characteristics of patients who participate in clinical trials may differ considerably from those that are eligible in an external data source, and this could result in bias or differences in the way that the outcome is occurring. So it's very important to assess the suitability of a potential comparator. You would need to evaluate your proposed data source with respect to 3 major categories of variables that are used to derive effect measures, including exposure and outcome and covariates. The second challenge faced is reducing the potential for information bias. So one of the major design considerations for creating external controls for regulatory decisions is to make sure that we're able to quantify any potential remaining bias as part of a sensitivity analysis. That way we can identify any limitations and evaluate the generalizability of the study results. Again, it's most important to understand how the exposure, outcome, and covariate variables are being ascertained and what the recording practices of the external cohort control data is to determine if they're comparable to the trial participants. The ultimate goal is to strive for similarity in the extent and quality of data capture of information between the external controls and the clinical trial to reduce bias as much as possible. I'll share a few examples of both positive and negative submissions that we've seen in the US with the FDA. This example was supporting an oncology indication, and it was a positive example in which the real-world evidence demonstrated a significant benefit for both outcomes for initial accelerated approval. There was also a confirmatory phase 3 trial planned, which was potentially part of the success of this submission. There was appropriate analytic design. They used propensity score matched analyses, weighted analyses for prognostic factors, and they had a decent sample size of close to 1,000 patients. There was another very public submission that came out a few years ago, the drug selinexor, in which they submitted a proposal to the FDA using external control. This was not accepted by the FDA, and there was a lot of lessons learned from this submission. The proposed indication was for relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. One of the major challenges was in this single-arm trial, there was a limited efficacy and significant toxicity. So they were starting off with challenges before they introduced their real-world data. They constructed an external control cohort using Flatiron Oncology EHR data, and they didn't pre-specify the analytic plan with the FDA. There was a lot of methodologic issues, a lack of comparability with the trial population, a lot of missing data, and the FDA concluded that this submission was not appropriate and the real-world data would not be used as part of the submission package. So through both of these examples, there were a lot of lessons learned for companies seeking to use real-world data for regulatory purposes. Early interaction with the health authority is necessary and critical. Another is data need to be fit for purpose. We need to do repeated feasibility analyses on each data source to assess the quality and the validity of the data, and make sure that you clearly understand measures for key variables, the exposure, endpoint, and covariates. There needs to be a pre-specification of analysis plan. The protocol should be registered, and it should include multiple sensitivity analyses and have the potential for replication. Any potential biases that could be foreseen need to be addressed within the design, and there should be cross-functional collaboration early and often. Looking forward to the state of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making, we have always used prospective data collection, and we're starting to use more routine collection for non-research purposes. We have randomized controlled trials, we have clinical registries, we're starting to see more pragmatic studies, we're starting to use more electronic health records, hospital billing records, databases, and administrative claims. In the future, we're working towards more hybrid types of studies where we can merge data through each of these sources. Here's an example of a pragmatic study that was done using a schizophrenic treatment. In schizophrenia, poor treatment adherence is a common occurrence. Prior randomized controlled trials had produced very inconsistent results for long-acting injectables versus oral therapies, and there was a lack of generalizability to a real-world setting. Because it's difficult to study schizophrenic patients in a randomized controlled trial, given their repeated contact with the criminal justice system, frequent hospitalizations, substance use, and uncivil living arrangements, a real-world study using pragmatic design was suitable for this analysis. The design was sought to demonstrate the benefit of a once monthly injectable versus daily oral antipsychotics. This study was able to demonstrate superiority of a 1 monthly injectable to the oral daily antipsychotics. It was an open label active comparator in a high-risk patient population. All of the primary endpoints were independently identified by a blinded event monitoring board with no knowledge of the treatment assignment. This real-world evidence added results to the label that was previously approved, showing the improvement based on a change in formulation due to the improved adherence. Another example of a real-world study that was used to inform regulatory decision-making was for canagliflozin, which is a diabetes therapy. We sought to look at heart failure hospitalization as well as below-knee leg amputation. This was a study using 4 different US-based administrative claims databases, and it was a head-to-head study looking at different drugs in the class and outside of the class. It was a retrospective observational comparative cohort study, and we conducted many sensitivity analyses, hundreds actually, looking at different exposures, different times at risks, different confounding controls, and different outcomes types. We used empirical calibration to make sure that we accounted for any unmeasured residual bias using negative controls. What we were able to show using these databases was that canagliflozin had a lower risk of overall hospitalization for heart failure, as well as no difference for below-knee leg amputation. This analysis was a critical example for how real-world evidence can be conducted in a reliable way. We pre-registered the study. We had a full study protocol, full statistical analysis plan, and registered all of the amendments. We provided full source code for the execution and published all of the study results. And here I'll leave you with just a few different working group white papers that are actively working to improve standards for the use of real-world data in regulatory decision-making. Thank you.
Obrigada, Gina. Vamos para o próximo, então. Julia?
Yes, I'm going to share my, I'm going to share my slides. Please let me know if you don't see it. So can you see the slides? Okay, great. Let me see, hold on. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Interpharma and Anvisa for giving me the opportunity to share some of my experience in RWE. I'm Julia Luan from AstraZeneca. Before AZ, I worked in the US FDA CDER Office of Biostatistics for 13 years as a primary reviewer, team leader, and acting deputy division director. And because of my statistics background, I have a strong interest and passion in this field. My topic today is, can observational studies be used to support effectiveness in regulatory decision-making? And here I want to explain very briefly why I chose this topic. the industry has been using RWE studies to support pre-market and post-market safety evaluation for many years. And regulators around the world have accepted RWE studies for safety decision-making, and we have many guidelines to follow, just like previous speakers explained. And however, using RWE studies to support effectiveness decision-making is still an area under development. And in recent years, regulators, industry, and academia have done extensive work to evaluate if observational studies can be used to support effectiveness in regulatory decision-making. So today I will share some of my thoughts about this. And here is the agenda for today. I will first introduce requirements for approval and a global regulatory environment. And then I will talk about learnings from RCT duplicate initiative. And at the end, I will discuss challenges and give a few take-home messages. First, let's take a look at the requirements for approval. I want to clarify that the requirements for approval I talk about here is US FDA's requirements. And however, the approval requirements of different agencies around the world are quite similar and generally share the same basic principles of the FDA's requirements. And there are three requirements: safety, manufacturing, and effectiveness. Safety and manufacturing are not the focus of today, so I will skip. And for effectiveness, and we know substantial evidence is required for drug approval. And then the question is, what is substantial evidence? A Harris Amendment or drug efficacy amendment clearly state that the substantial evidence is evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations. So the key words here are adequate and well-controlled. And then the next follow-up question is, what's adequate and well-controlled study? About this question, US Code for Regulation, CFR, has very clear descriptions. It includes 7 criteria. And first, clear objectives and summary of methods and results. And number 2, design permits a valid comparison with a control, either concurrent or historical control. And number 3, adequate selection of patients. And number 4, is the method of assigning patients to treatment and control groups minimizes bias. And currently, randomization is the commonly accepted method to address this. And number 5, adequate measures to minimize biases on subjects, observers, and analysts. And currently, blending is the commonly accepted method to address this. And number 6, well-defined and reliable assessment of subjects' responses. And number 7, adequate analysis to assess drug results. Some of you might be wondering, in recent years, lots of discussions about the increased application of RWD, RWE. During the pandemic, the FDA has issued many flexible policies and guidelines. Will the evidentiary standard be different? The answer is a clear no. There is no difference. The 21st Century Cure Act clearly states that the use of RWD, RWE does not mean changing the evidentiary standard. And this means that the 7 criteria on my previous slides are still applicable and required. And we still need substantial evidence, and we still need an adequate and well-controlled study. Next, I will introduce the global regulatory environment relevant to observational studies. First, let's take a look at the US FDA. We know that the FDA published the RWE framework at the end of 2018. Within this framework, the FDA said as part of the RWE program, the FDA will evaluate the potential role of observational studies in evaluating the effectiveness of drugs. And although this is only a short sentence, it's a huge step forward for the FDA. In the past, the FDA didn't even consider the use of observational studies for effectiveness evaluation for indication-seeking purposes. However, putting this topic on the agenda is already a significant step forward. The FDA also made it very clear that the non-randomization creates a huge challenge for establishing causal inference. So we need to solve the challenge of causal inference so that the FDA's acceptance of observational studies for effectiveness decision-making will increase. The FDA also plans to issue guidance about observational studies designs using RWD, including whether and how these studies might provide RWE to support effectiveness in regulatory decision-making. And in addition, the FDA anticipates applying many of the principles outlined in the guidance when evaluating observational studies to support effectiveness changes in labeling. And now let's take a look at these principles. Generally speaking, there are three principles. The RWD are fit for use. That's the first and the foremost principle. And this means that the data need to be reliable, valid, and relevant. Reliability also means the data need to be accurate, complete, and consistent. The second principle is the trial and study design can provide adequate scientific evidence to help answer the regulatory question. And number three, the study conduct meets the regulatory requirements. And here I want to share a very recent example which gives a new signal from the FDA about observational studies. On July 16 this year, only less than 2 months ago, the FDA approved a new use for Prograph based on an observational study providing RWE of effectiveness. FDA approved the Prograph for use in combination with other immunosuppressant drugs to prevent organ rejection in adult and pediatric patients receiving lung transplantation. In the announcement, the FDA states that this approval reflects how a well-designed non-interventional study relying on fit-for-purpose RWD, when compared with a suitable control, can be considered adequate and well-controlled under FDA regulations. And this is new. This is probably the first time that the FDA says an observational study can be considered adequate and well-controlled study. In the same announcement, the FDA states that in addition to the RWE from the non-interventional study, randomized controlled trials of Prograph used in other solid organ transplant settings provided confirmatory evidence of effectiveness. There is often some misunderstanding about the term of confirmatory evidence. And some people think it means that it provides the evidence that's the basis for approval, while other people think it means that it provides supportive evidence for approval. Last week, I had the opportunity to talk to an FDA senior leader about this, and he clarified with me that confirmatory evidence means that this study provides supportive evidence that confirms the evidence generated from the trial that is the basis for approval. So in summary, and this is probably the first time the FDA says an observational study can be considered an adequate, well-controlled study. It's a very noticeable step forward for the FDA, and that is why I say this example gives a new signal from the FDA about observational studies. However, I want to point out that Prograf is a very, very special case. It's a highly effective drug. It's already on the market for many years. Very good safety profile, and the efficacy of this drug is indisputable. The study has a high quality registry to provide fit for purpose data. I believe the company will start talking about the details about this approval in public forums. We can keep an eye on this case. The EU also has taken many initiatives in RWD, RWE in recent years. Since previous speakers have discussed this, I don't need to elaborate. However, I'd like to bring one article to your attention. On September 3rd, about 10 days ago, the Pink Seed published an article called EMA lays out the plans for routine use of real-world evidence. And this article states that a panel of regulators overseeing the implementation of several big data projects within the EU medicine network has given details of real-world evidence integration pilots to be undertaken next year by various European medicines agency scientific committees. So if you are interested in knowing these pilot projects in more detail, please take a look at this article. And now let's take a look at the China CDE. In January 3rd, the beginning of last year, CDE issued a general RWE guidance. And in August 2020, CDE issued an RWE guidance for pediatric drugs. And in April 2021, CDE issued a guidance specifically for real-world data. And this slide presents some excerpts regarding the observational research in the CDE RWE guidance. Sorry, it's not in English or Portuguese. In summary, CDE also gives green light to use observational research to support effectiveness, but it also points out that the most important limitations of observational studies. These limitations point out by the CDE are actually very similar to those pointed out by the FDA. So the regulatory agencies have some common understanding about this topic. Japan PMDA had some new initiatives in recent years, indicating their growing interest in regulatory use of RWE. For example, this March, PMDA published draft guidelines for use of patient registry data in regulatory filing. And this April, Clinical Innovation Network Working Group was expanded to RWD Working Group. And again, since previous speakers have talked about this, I don't need to elaborate. Next, I'm going to use a few minutes to introduce RCT duplicate initiative. As many of you are aware, in order to evaluate the use of observational studies to support effectiveness decision-making and to investigate the difference between the observational studies and the gold standard of RCT studies, the FDA initiated the RCT duplicate initiative in 2017. At that time, I was still working at the FDA, and I know that this is a study project initiated by Dr. Janet Woodcock, the director of FDA CDER at that time. People in the industry know that Dr. Woodcock has committed to modernizing drug regulation and improving the efficiency of new drug research and development. The Preliminary results of RCT duplicate were published in the journal Circulation and this March. This article summarizes the results of the first 10 RWE replication studies. Due to time limitation, today I will only briefly introduce this RCT duplicate initiative. And this initiative uses prospective trial design and epidemiological methods to replicate randomized controlled trials. Its main purpose is to assess the magnitude of and reasons for differences between RCT findings and the findings from corresponding RWE emulations. The RWE studies mentioned in this article are actually observational studies. The picture on the left shows the general process of RCT duplicate. And first, many RCTs are screened and some of them are selected as target trials. And then the RWE replication studies are designed and executed. After that, the results of the RWE studies and the RCT studies are compared. The 10 RWE replication studies included in this article are all in the field of antibiotic drugs and antiplatelet drugs. The primary endpoints of these 3 replicate studies was 3 adverse cardiovascular events, also called 3-point MACE, including cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. Please note that these endpoints are considered hard endpoints by the regulators. And here I want to point out that these 10 studies are not a random sample of RCT trials. It's a select group of trials, and that could likely be emulated in longitudinal claims data. The selection process was driven by the availability of relevant data of sufficient quality. RCT duplicate pre-specified 3 binary agreement metrics. The first metric is regulatory agreement. It's defined as the ability of the RWE study to replicate the direction and the statistical significance of the RCT finding. And second, estimate agreement. It's defined as an RWE hazard ratio estimate, and that was within the 95% CI for the RCT estimate. And number 3 is the standardized difference. It's to use hypothesis tests to evaluate whether there was a difference in findings by calculating the standardized difference between the RCT and the RWE effect estimates. And here are the results of RCT duplicate. For regulatory agreement, among the 10 studies, 6 studies achieved regulatory agreement. It means that 6 RWE studies can replicate the direction and statistical significance of the RCT studies. And for estimate agreement, 8 studies achieved estimate agreement. It means that for 8 studies, the RWE HR hazard ratio estimate is within the 95% confidence interval for the RCT estimate. And for standardized difference, 9 studies achieved agreement. It means that for 9 studies, and there is no significant difference between the RWE study and RCT study. So what do you think of these results? 6 out of 10, 8 out of 10, and 9 out of 10. I guess some people see opportunities and believe the victory is coming, while others see challenges and feels that it's still a long way to go. And here are the conclusions of the RCT duplicate initiative excerpted from the paper. These conclusions are not my conclusion, that's the conclusion in the paper. And first, agreement between RCT and RWE findings varies depending on which agreement metric is used. And second, concordance between RCT and RWE findings is not guaranteed. And third, the findings here are based on a selected sample of studies where RWD could emulate the outcome measures satisfactorily, and the key confounding factors were observable. And the last, more evidence is needed to understand the circumstances that determine whether RWE findings can predictably match those of RCTs across different therapeutic areas. Next, I will summarize the challenges of using observational studies to support effectiveness in regulatory decision-making. The challenge comes from study design, study conduct, data collection, and data analysis. For study design, non-randomization creates a challenge for establishing causal inference, and unblending creates challenges for minimizing biases on subjects, observers, and analysts. And for study conduct, we need to meet regulatory requirements, for example, study monitoring and data collection. And in addition, we need to register observational studies for transparency. And this is not an issue for RCT, but it is challenging for observational studies. And there are lots of challenges in data collections. The data need to be reliable, which means accurate, complete, consistent. Also, the data need to be valid and relevant. And in addition, traceability, comparability, data sharing, privacy, and data ownership are also challenging for observational studies. And for data analysis, pre-specification and control for confounding are very challenging for observational studies. And the challenges in data analysis is closely related to study design. So if we can solve the challenges in study design, and then we can subsequently resolve the challenges in data analysis. I believe with strong partnership and close collaboration among the agencies, industry, and academia, and these challenges will be resolved step by step. And at the end, I like to give you a few take-home messages. First, recent RCT replication projects improved our understanding about the methodology for observational studies, but major concerns about the validity of observational studies still remain. And second, challenges of using observational studies to support effectiveness in regulatory decision-making and come from study design and data collection, data analysis, and study conduct. And third, we are making progress in using observational studies to support effectiveness in regulatory decision-making, but it's still a long and challenging journey. By the way, I chose 3 pictures representing 3 things I like most about Brazil: the carnival, the Rio, and the soccer. But I have never been to Brazil. It's certainly on the top of my travel list, and hopefully my dream can come true in the near future. That's all I have, and thank you very much. And I welcome any questions and comments at the QA session. Thank you.
Obrigada, Júlia. Obrigado a todos os speakers pelas apresentações. Bom, então agora abriremos para perguntas. Por favor, quem quiser fazer as perguntas pode estar disponível aqui a opção de acesso ao microfone. Caso seja alguma pergunta escrita, por favor, em português.
Priscila?
Oi, Cláudio.
É o Cláudio. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta, um comentário e uma pergunta, né? Bom, essa abertura, né, para se utilizar os dados das evidências de vida real, enfim, ela abre uma série de perspectivas né, muito importantes, muito interessantes, e aqui no Brasil, de modo particular, que tem um sistema de saúde público e que o governo, né, o Ministério da Saúde tem interesse em uma série de produtos, enfim, que não, de novas indicações, né, que não necessariamente os seus desenvolvedores têm interesse, né? Então, abre a oportunidade de que os órgãos, o Ministério da Saúde, enfim, utilize também desta ferramenta para poder aprovar ou pedir a aprovação dessas novas indicações. E a Júlia citou o exemplo do Prograf, né, do tacrolimus, que é um dos casos aqui no Brasil bastante discutido, né, que não tem essa indicação terapêutica para rejeição de órgãos aprovada, mas é de uso, eu digo para alguns órgãos, não me lembro exatamente, eu sei que tem para alguns, para outros não, e é uma grande discussão, né, porque são produtos importantes e que às vezes não tem um registro, e é de interesse do Ministério da Saúde ter essa nova indicação, enfim, para utilizar no Sistema Único de Saúde. Bom, esse foi só um comentário. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta. Inicialmente foi falado a respeito do Big Data, né, que o EMA me parece que está desenvolvendo. Eu acho que esse banco de dados, eu acho que vai ser talvez o mais importante para tudo isso, né, para ter acesso aos dados, enfim, como a Júlia bem comentou, tem ainda essa questão do registro de estudos observacionais, mas, por exemplo, se você olhar uma base como Clinical Trials, né, que nós utilizamos, enfim, esses resultados nem sempre são encontrados, os resultados desses estudos. Enfim, eu acho que o Big Data será muito importante, né, para que se possa acessar os dados desses estudos que serão utilizados. Aí a minha pergunta se esse Big Data que o EMA me parece que está desenvolvendo seria de acesso só para a comunidade europeia, ou se pensa em acesso para geral, né, para acesso público de forma geral. Eu acho que a Julie, né, que falou inicialmente do...
Yes, thank you for the question. My understanding is that certainly it is for use within the European Union medicines regulatory system.
I think it raises a broader issue. There are a variety of different data sources available coming from national healthcare systems, national electronic health record systems, as well as private sector IT firms that collect and curate some of this data. So we're very much in a world where a lot of this data is federated and coming from a variety of different sources. And there's really a need to further align incentives to make sure that this information that's being collected is being collected in a sufficiently high quality structured format that it can then be used for real world evidence research purposes. But I think that there's a lot of work that needs to continue to go towards that type of standardization and data access across these different public and private data sources. But we are at an inflection point now where the data in many, many cases is fit for purpose for use in regulatory decision making. And I think we're continuing to partner with data firms, different national authorities to even further improve some of the quality and accessibility of different sources.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, assuming the question relates to the Darwin system, the use cases for Darwin are not yet defined. That will happen over the next 12 to 24 months and beyond. However, it is anticipated that those use cases would be throughout the life cycle of drugs. And also in addition, in future, it is likely that it may also help inform decisions around HTA. So not just limited to the purely regulatory question.
I can add one more comment to that. I think first, just as Julie mentioned in her presentation, I think in this field, RWD, RWE, it really requires the global convergence. I guess different regulatory agencies need to collaborate very closely together. And also another aspect is this the applicability of the real-world data collected in other countries, whether or not it's applicable to your local population. For example, recently I'm running an RWE trial using registry in Europe. But we went to the FDA, we asked the FDA, do you think we can seek a registration in the US? But the FDA said yes, because the population are similar. So the data generated using European registries also can be considered applicable for the US population. So I think about a similar idea, if there is, if in Brazil, in certain area, there's no, a very established registry for certain disease area, but maybe, if the population, if the data generated from other regions can be considered applicable to the Brazil population, and maybe Anvisa can consider that. I just want to add this comment. Thank you.
Perfeito, obrigada. Temos uma pergunta aqui no chat. Na opinião dos speakers, qual a importância de um framework guideline oficial sobre RWE e RWD? Quais países podem ser utilizados como benchmarking para os países que ainda não possuem esse tipo de framework guideline?
So maybe I can start on this one. Oh, sure, and Andrew, feel free to add. But yeah, I think it's certainly, at least from my perspective, important to have at least some sort of level setting of when and where like a health authority might consider the use of real-world evidence. And we've seen, for example, the FDA framework, some of these more general guidances that I mentioned in Asia sort of at least spell out, even though it's not maybe in the actual legislation, sort of the situations where they might consider the use of real-world evidence, whether it's for new indications, new product approvals, adding new data into the label, that can sort of help provide that context to sponsors for the country. But that being said, as you saw, there's quite a lot of frameworks out there, and whether unofficially some countries might want to defer to others, that can be okay as well. But that's sort of some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think that it's important to develop these types of regional frameworks as a signal to sponsors in the research community that there's a willingness to evaluate this data, and some very high-level considerations around the context of how it will be evaluated. But at the same time, it's also important that it not be overly prescriptive or overly detailed, because this is a rapidly moving field. And we want to make sure that there's the right level of regulatory flexibility to allow the state of the science to continue to evolve. So there's a bit of a balancing act there. But I think that ultimately we're going to see a lot of these regional frameworks converge towards something that's a little bit more internationally and globally compatible in the years to come.
Yeah, I can add, I fully agree what Andrew just explained. And I think it's, based on my, research in this field, I see the regulators around the world, actually they share some basic principles in the field of RWD, RWE, because, for example, they all require high quality data and the study design and the study conduct. But there are some, I do notice some slight differences among different guidelines. For example, for China, China's, the guideline for the real world data, they actually, their definition for real world data is a little broader than the FDA's definition. It's because China CDE want to include, the real world data from Chinese medicine. So this is their, their local, they have some local considerations. They have to take that into the picture. So I guess that would be very helpful if the regulators can use, the general principle, share the general principles, but with variations or specifications just tailored to their specific reason.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Julia has said there, I think this is really where the opportunities for multilateral cooperation are very essential. Because this field is changing so rapidly, and because there is an overwhelming amount of information to absorb and understand, I think some of those examples that were shared during the presentations are really, really important to allow the stakeholders involved in developing the guidance to discuss and understand the different perspectives as the guidances are being developed, whether they be a global consensus position or some regional type of guidance.
Perfeito, obrigada. Mais alguma pergunta?
Está no chat, Pri.
Ok. Alguém... Claro, por favor, Cláudia.
Só mais uma questão. Nós, acho que uma pergunta para todos, nós vimos que realmente há muitas iniciativas em diferentes países e diferentes regiões, guias e discussões. As discussões já são feitas há muito tempo, né? Alguns históricos nós vimos aí que começaram em 2016, e, enfim, há bastante tempo se discute essa questão de uso de evidências de vida real. E a minha pergunta é, se do ponto de vista prático, como os speakers estão vendo, se há muitas experiências práticas nesse sentido, né? A Julie citou o exemplo do FDA sobre o Prograf, mas a minha pergunta é se isso é uma prática que tem se visto que está aumentando em outros países, ou ainda continuam ainda discutindo os regulamentos, os guias, enfim.
I can speak to this a little bit, if I may, from a European perspective. So this was shared at a DIA meeting earlier this year when EMA were outlining many of these activities that are planned and ongoing. So they conducted a manual review of dossiers and assessment reports over a 2-year period. If I recall, it was 2018 and 19 to 19, to look at the role of real-world evidence in those applications. And I believe this will be published in a journal soon, but there was extensive use of real-world data and real-world evidence. I think up to 40% of MAAs relating mainly to post-authorization. And then in, I think, about a fifth of extension of indications. So that just gives you, an idea, I suppose, of what's happening on the ground is your question, in practice. So that's something I can recall from a DIA presentation by EMA earlier this year.
I can add a quick comment. I think we are towards the end of this workshop. It's what I see from all the recent examples, like several people mentioned the program example in my presentation, I see it's a very positive signal from the regulators. They are willing to give regulatory flexibility in this area. Like the program is a very special case, is a highly effective, very safe drug. It has been on the market for many years. The effectiveness is like 95% over 5%. So that's indisputable effectiveness. But for other field, if it's for another therapeutic area, for another endpoint, not the hard endpoint, the soft endpoint, I guess this case will not fly. So this is a very special case, but it really shows that the FDA is open to consider a well-designed, well-executed observational studies can be considered adequate, well-controlled. Thank you.
Perfeito, obrigada. Tem mais uma pergunta aqui no chat. Como dados de vida real podem ser utilizados para o registro de um medicamento novo? Quais subsídios poderiam trazer?
The question was for use of real-world evidence to support the initial approval of a new medicine.
Yes.
I think there are a number of opportunities, just outside of regulatory decision making itself. Sponsors are using real-world data all the time for R&D optimization, to better understand epidemiology, to better understand the disease, where to find patient populations for studies. But within the context of initial registration itself, there are a number of opportunities. One is the use of hybrid trials or pragmatic trials that can really leverage real-world evidence in a pre-market setting to build the initial evidence within the context of a broader clinical trial that can then support initial approval. But particularly in areas of very high unmet medical need, fast-moving diseases, rare diseases, the use of an external control arm or a synthetic control can be very important in instances where it's really just not ethical or appropriate to have a placebo arm. And a lot of the early examples we've seen of initial approval on the basis of RWE have really been using that external control arm. So there's a lot of opportunities. Companies are really exploring all of them, but we really see the opportunities across the entire life cycle from pre-market to post-market.
Yeah, I completely agree with Andrew. Maybe just to add a couple additional use cases to share more of a flavor of the variety of different ways real limits might be used in registration. So in addition to external controls that was mentioned, and also comparative effectiveness via a pragmatic trial or observational study like with Prograf, there's also some more supplemental uses that might not be immediately apparent. For example, population bridging, perhaps there might be a difference in the standard of care from one region to the next. And perhaps the randomized clinical study that was in the initial pivotal study was using a different standard of care, and real limits can help bridge that. Another use is looking at long-term effects and outcomes. So you might have a registry looking at very long-term efficacy outcomes, longer than what was used in the study. And then lastly, maybe another use to throw out there is, perhaps you're interested in developing a new, more novel surrogate clinical endpoint, and real limits can be part of the sort of evidence package that helps support the validation of that surrogate endpoint, linking it to long-term outcomes. That's maybe some of the other more supplemental uses that real limits can be used.
Obrigada.
Mais uma questão aqui. Pri.
Hoje a questão de qualidade de dados e conceito de estudo bem desenhados ainda segue o rigor do RCTs. Há tendência de discussão destes pontos para a RWE, considerando as limitações existentes?
Maybe I could take a stab at this one. There are a number of ways that we evaluate the quality of real-world data, some of which I touched on. But I think what we're finding is one of the most important things we need to do is ensure that data is fit for purpose. So as has been brought up, using an external control arm, are we looking at the same population? Are we establishing the same set of criteria for inclusion, exclusion criteria? Are we evaluating how all of the outcomes are being defined and assessed? Is the exposure captured in a similar way to the source data of the RCT? That in itself, along with ensuring that the data source uses a regulatory grade and that we have audits in place. Additionally, I think another key concept is that of the sensitivity analysis. We all know that there can be a large degree of residual bias with real-world data. And so it's important to pre-specify a number of sensitivity analyses to ensure that we're quantifying any potential residual bias that exists. There's a long way to go, but we have come, I think our methodologic rigor that is being used towards real-world data has brought us, further than we were 10 years ago. And I think that's why we're seeing more regulatory uptake of these types of data sources now.
Obrigada. Mais uma pergunta. Gostaria de saber se existe algum tipo de artigo de revisão com todos os casos de utilização de RWD e RWE no cenário regulatório e os aprendizados com cada um dos casos.
I know I don't have the link now, but I know there are some articles there summarize the use of RWD, RWE. The examples in US, EU, and China, Japan. I know there is article like this, but I'm not aware there is an article that has all the cases. I think if we look at multiple articles, we may have a much better sense. If you Google the RWE cases, I think there are some article will come up. It's not exact, it will not give you exhaustive list, but maybe most of the cases.
Yeah, there are some ongoing industry benchmarking efforts in Brazil, the US, and EU, asking companies to share as many examples as possible to really try to aggregate, what therapeutic areas are we really seeing it in, what are the use cases that are most common, and so a lot of those efforts are ongoing. Also, some of the real-world data firms themselves have some very excellent trackers, Aetion, Cubia, and others on their websites. They have a pretty good repository of various, particularly FDA decisions that have leveraged real-world evidence. So there are a variety of sources out there. So we'd be happy to share those offline if you like.
There was also a publication recently from FDA that sort of gives an overview of use of real-world evidence at the agency. That being said, though, it doesn't really go into the details of each individual specific case. Happy to sort of send that in the chat to give a flavor of the overall sort of perspective, but then would definitely follow along what the other speakers have said for the more specific case examples, looking at different trackers that are done by data companies or other literature articles.
Yeah, I want to add a quick comment because I'm working on a paper on this right now. So I want to add a quick comment is, when you read those cases about learnings and the experience, we have to be very careful because sometimes even though the company announced that we submit real-world data and then this drug is approved, it doesn't mean the real-world data, real-world evidence is the basis of approval. So if we really want to know that, we need to read the approval package for that particular product. And in the approval package, either the FDA or other agency will clearly lay out, if whether or not the real world data, real world evidence was considered in the approval process. Because I noticed in several cases, actually there are several very noticeable famous cases. The sponsor made a wrong claim and say, okay, we got approval based on real world data, real world evidence. However, the FDA approval package clearly said that there is that weakness. We cannot take the real world data, real world evidence into consideration in the approval process. So we have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And, one of the themes that we commonly hear in real world evidence circles is really evaluating the totality of evidence. In many cases, the real world evidence will be supportive of a broader body of evidence that includes preclinical data, that includes previous clinical trials, that's consistent with the mechanism of action and the biological plausibility of the product. So all of that really needs to be taken together within the context of what the real world data is telling us and looking at that bigger picture.
And I just sent that article in the chat, and once again, that was FDA approvals. And this manuscript was from, or this publication was actually from Duke Margolis Center of Policy in the US.
Com isso, a gente encerra, agradecendo a participação de todos e desejando uma boa tarde para todos e um excelente trabalho. Obrigada, pessoal.
E até semana que vem.
E até semana que vem, exatamente.
Até semana que vem. Boa tarde a todos.
Thank you.
Tchau, tchau.
Thank you so much.